So I'm here with Miss Helen Joyce, and it's very good to speak to you today, Helen.
Thank you very much.
So can you tell us a little bit about your background, just for the benefit of people at home who might not have heard of you or your work, and how you became interested in writing about gender and gender identity?
I was a journalist for a long time, from 2005 at The Economist, and in about 2017, by sheer chance, somebody said to me, why do kids keep coming home and saying that such and such is trans? And I said, I have no idea, but I'll look into it for you. And I did. I ended up writing about it. The reaction was bizarre. It was the first time in my journalistic career that people would tell me I was a Nazi for asking a simple question. I realised that you're not meant to talk about this, but as a journalist, there's nothing you're not meant to talk about, and in particular, you're meant to go towards the questions that are the hardest and the most controversial. And so I just kept thinking about it and kept writing about it. And then when I finally discovered that the consequences of what I call gender identity ideology include that children are being sterilised, and disproportionately gay children are being sterilised, that was the moment when I knew I had to write a book.
I believe that book was Trans When Ideology Meets Reality. Is that correct?
Yes, that was the title when it was published in 2020, and it got great reviews mostly. It did very well in the UK. It was a Times top 10 bestseller. It was listed in several outlets, best books of the year, including The Spectator and The Observer. But I have never been mentioned in the Irish Times or RTE. Was not reviewed there. I have never been interviewed on Irish state media either.
Why do you think that is?
I mean, it's controversial, sure, but it's also that I haven't been interviewed on the BBC either, I should say, and I haven't been on BBC Woman's Hour, for example. So these legacy media organisations have bought into the idea that people who say they are women, that's who women are. So men can be women if men say they're women. And my book says, no, that's not the case. That there are two meaningful categories, men and women. And for some people, that's an ideology that's akin to Nazism. So places like RTE and the Irish Times just ignore me.
We've heard some members of Parliament in Ireland, TDs and so on, who have made remarks to the effect of there are certain topics that are beyond debate, and that they include transgenderism as one of those topics. That they say things like people's rights aren't up for debate, and by rights they mean people's transgender rights, the rights to transition, or teach some of this ideology to children and so on. Do you think that there's any topic that's beyond debate?
I mean, to the contrary, I think that the right to freedom of expression is a human right. Like, if you look at the lists of human rights, they include freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of belief. So those include within them the right to respectfully state what your beliefs are. And yes, they're qualified rights, and they will on occasion butt up against other people's privacy. But if you want to say in a general way that you think there are two meaningful categories, male and female, and that it is not possible to move from one of those categories to another, that is a very ordinary belief, and obviously you have every right to say it.
How do you define gender personally, and how does that differ from the mainstream understanding of gender?
Well, if you find out what the mainstream understanding of gender is, do tell me, because I think it's one of those words that has many meanings. Most people just mean sex. And then another meaning might be something in feminism, which is about the constraints that are on each of the two sexes in terms of their behaviour. And then there's this third meaning that has arisen in activist cultures in the past 10 years or so, which is that your gender is some sort of innate sense of who you are, like something like, I call it like a sexed soul. And we're all meant to have a gender identity. And those of us who are recognised as male at birth, who think of themselves as male, well, their gender identity matches their body, and they are called cis. And those people who feel their gender identity to be something that is not matched to what they were told they were at birth, like what was written on their birth certificate, they're trans. This is a really, really marginal and recent ideology. Very few people believe it or even understand it. And yet it is the dominant belief about what gender and gender identity are in elite institutions. It's been put into law in Ireland, of course, and it's how you're meant to talk on RTE and in the Irish Times, and saying anything else apparently according to RTDs is bigotry.
I mean, it's intriguing to me, listening to some of the discourse around this issue, that you'll hear the most mainstream politicians, these are not fringe individuals, up to and including the Taoiseach, referring to not just transgenderism, but he'll rattle off in a spiel things about non-binary this and non-binary that. And of course, for people who aren't familiar with it, if you identify as non-binary, you're saying not only am I somebody with male parts who identifies as female, you're saying I'm not a male or a female, I'm something else entirely. And I've never heard a politician define or explain how that could be possible or how that works. What do you think is driving this movement, I suppose, to always seem to be, it seems like every 6 months or so it metamorphosizes and becomes even more confusing than it originally was?
Well, it keeps changing because it's entirely unmoored from reality. So it's got no connection with anything objective. And that means it's like a hot air balloon that you've untied the moorings and it's just going to float off into space. So that's why it keeps changing. And why do people who are supposed to be grown-up people who are in charge of our systems of laws and who are meant to be working within an evidence-based liberal human rights framework, why do they fall for this sort of stuff? I mean, one reason is because if you don't, you get shouted at a lot and you get told that you're a bigot, and if you often can even lose your job. So they try to sidestep it. I can't think that Leo Varadkar, who is actually a doctor, seriously thinks that it is possible to change sex, or seriously thinks that there are any human beings who don't have a sex. He just cannot think that that's what non-binary means. So I think he must mean that it's kind of a label that expresses how people feel about themselves, and it would be cruel not to accept that label. And if that's the case, fine. People can call themselves non-binary if they want. As long as I'm allowed to say, according to my belief and my perceptions, well, that's fine, you can call yourself non-binary, but I can see that you're a man, or I can see that you're a woman. And if you're a man, please don't come into the women's changing rooms, don't try and compete in women's sports. That's the problem, is when these things get institutionalised and we have idiocies like having a non-binary category in the marathon.
What do you think of the fact that there was a report in, I believe it was the Irish Independent just a month or so ago, that said Irish politicians, government politicians from parties like Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil are saying they're getting inundated with more emails about transgender issues, like, for example, the case of Barbie Kardashian, a violent biological male who was put into a women's prison. They're getting more emails and correspondence about that from irate citizens than they are about issues that you would think would be higher on people's agenda, like the eviction ban and various economic issues, that people are more incensed about this, and that it looks like they're kind of thinking about changing tack on some of these issues. What do you think of that? And do you think that there's sort of a levee about to break culturally on this issue?
I think any politician who isn't willing to answer a straight question with an obvious answer, like, do you agree that there are male people and female people and it's not possible for male people to be female? If a politician isn't willing to just give a straight answer to that, then that politician is a liar and a coward. And I think that's extremely relevant to the question of whether you would vote for that person or whether you would be willing to have them in a position of power. So it's entirely reasonable for people to keep asking politicians these questions, and it is entirely reasonable for voters to take that into consideration, even though obviously this is a marginal issue and there are real questions about things like cost of living. Until you don't give a straight answer to a straight question, you are going to keep getting asked the straight question. So the only way out of this for politicians is to get off the fence, grow a spine, and say, yes, I understand that there are two sexes and that we destroy people's rights if we deny that fact. If they do that, this will go away. It'll be painful for a short time, but then it will go away.